Mr. Crowley, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Joining us now is Steve Clemons of New America Foundation. Mr. Clemons, how do both Senators Obama and McCain define their principles on national security? What are they campaigning on?
Well, right now, as of yesterday, Barack Obama is trying very hard to tie national security to what's going on in the economy. That's what's on people's minds, but he made a very strong statement that the line that's traditionally held between national security and foreign policy issues and what's going on at home has to be removed, and we need to rebuild that. John McCain is still very much on the notion that American prestige and its place in the world are under attack globally, and we need to be there stronger than we've been before and not yield to the temptation to pull out of places, because that will be perceived by much of the world as a loss for the United States.
With that in mind, what kind of policy issues are both of the candidates bringing out as far as their national security policies are concerned?
Well, I think some of the things that Barack Obama's trying to do, he met yesterday with some senior members of his national security working group, I think in a way to sort of show that he's consulting with very smart, informed people, many of whom had been in previous Democratic administrations, on how to deal with challenges. And one of the issues that's really bubbling to the surface right now is Afghanistan. A lot of focus on Afghanistan and what needs to be done. And truth be told, the honest differences between John McCain and Barack Obama on Afghanistan aren't that great. Both of them feel that a lot more American servicemen need to be deployed to the region, something with which I have concern about, actually, in the sense that it's beginning to look very much like what the Soviets did, maybe for different reasons, but looking at sending more armed American men and women into this, and also looking at what our European allies can do. Some of the discussion in the Obama camp, if it does in fact win, has been centered around the issue of might they carry on Defense Secretary Robert Gates into the position, because he's been very focused on Afghanistan as well. So that's one of the areas that they're pushing on. But across the board, when you look at Iran, you look at Afghanistan, you look at the ongoing challenges in Iraq, and then there are other issues such as nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation questions. Both teams are trying to line up their teams and policies and strategies on those.
We're going to talk about national security issues with our guest, Steve Clemons. And if you want to ask him questions about the various candidates, their positions, and other issues on national security, the numbers you can call are, if you support Senator McCain, it's 202-737-0001. If you support Senator Obama, it's 202-737-0002. And if you support others, 202-628-0205. We have two clips, both gentlemen speaking about their national security interest and their issues. I want to play them both back to back and get your input on them.
Okay.
And make no mistake, we're confronting an urgent crisis in Afghanistan, and we have to act. It's time to heed the call from General McKiernan and others for more troops. That's why I'd send at least 2 or 3 additional brigades to Afghanistan. We also need more training for Afghan security forces, more non-security assistance to help Afghans develop alternatives to poppy farming, more safeguards to prevent corruption, and a new effort to crack down on cross-border terrorism. Only a comprehensive strategy that prioritizes Afghanistan and the fight against al-Qaeda will succeed, and that's the kind of change that I intend to bring as president. Now, there's a clear choice in this election. On issue after issue, Senator McCain has supported the key decisions and core approaches of President Bush. As president, he would continue the policies that have put our economy into crisis and, I believe, endangered our national security. And he's shown over the last few weeks he would also continue the divisive politics that undercuts the bipartisan cooperation and national unity that's so badly needed in challenging times.
The next president won't have time to get used to the office. He can't invite testing from the world. He will have to act immediately. We can't spend the next 4 years, as we have spent much of the last 8, hoping for our luck to change. We have to act immediately. As I said at the last debate, As I said at the last debate, I'm not George Bush. If Senator Obama wants to run against George Bush, he should have run for president 4 years ago. I know you're worried. America's a great country, but we're at a moment of national crisis that will determine our future. And let me just ask you this. Will we continue to lead the world's economies or will we be overtaken? Will the world become safer or more dangerous? Will our military remain the strongest in the world? Will our children and grandchildren's future be brighter than ours? My answer to you is yes. Yes, we will lead. Yes, we will prosper. Yes, we will be safer. Yes, we will pass on to our children a stronger, better country, but we must be prepared to act swiftly, boldly, with courage and wisdom. I am an American and I choose to fight. Don't give up hope. Be strong. Have courage and fight.
Steve Clemons.
Well, they're both two very different kinds of speeches. Barack Obama offered a great deal more detail about what he'd specifically do with regard to Afghanistan, dealing with al-Qaeda and, of course, the tribal regions in Pakistan. John McCain's speech is sort of an apples and oranges situation. It's much more of a rally, trying to inspire people to find and reach down for patriotism about America's great place and purposes in the world. The problem that both of them face, frankly, is that great powers deploy themselves in the world four ways: militarily, economically, morally, and with what I call the ingenuity factor. Militarily, we've shown key limits in the world in Iraq, and a lot of our allies doubt our abilities to achieve our results. Economically, a lot of the world thinks we've exported toxic financial products to them. Morally, we have problems of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib that still hang over our credibility on that front. And that leaves the fourth: what sort of new social bargain or contract will the United States cut with the rest of the world to kind of keep ourselves in the game and reestablish ourselves? I have some hope there, but neither one of them are dealing with this. And there are huge macro factors that to some degree are limiting what John McCain and Barack Obama can do. And when
macro factors in the four you described, or are there others to consider?
Well, there are macro factors in terms of global doubt about our ability to achieve results and not knowing what American priorities are. To some degree, my friendly critique of Barack Obama is maybe Afghanistan ought not to be the test of American power and place in the world. Yeah, Afghanistan has been a tough nut to solve. It's in a very tough neighborhood, and trying to deliver modern sort of contemporary democracy in our norms may be impossible, and throw other dynamics that get out of place. And on John McCain's front, the question of testing leadership, whether it's John McCain as the next president of the United States or Barack Obama, the world will test us, and crises will be created to see what's the difference between rhetoric and our real actions, and what we will gamble what's left of our power and prestige on. So to some degree, it won't matter which one of these people come into office. They'll both be strongly tested by circumstances, because we have probably the worst economic and worst national security portfolios to be inherited by any president in the last 5 or 6 decades. So it's a really remarkably difficult challenge for both of them. They're trying to differentiate themselves from each other, largely through rhetoric, but when it comes to the channels that they have to show that America's back in the game and has leverage over global events, it's going to be very few things that they can actually do.
You said test is. Do you agree with Senator Biden's recent statement about the testing of the next candidate as far as?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think I agree with Senator Biden that Barack Obama will be tested, and I agree that John McCain will be tested. I don't think there's anything implicit about John McCain's character or his resolve or his experience that would keep the world from testing his leadership as well, because the constraints on the United States are enormous today. So people want to sort out what will we really gamble? What are the new lines that are being drawn? How much leverage and power can we get through renewed collaborations with Europe, with Asia, with Japan? And you can't do much in the world today without China and Russia. That's just a fact of life. And we're not on real good terms with Russia right now. So what price are we willing to pay to get Chinese and Russian support on dealing with Iran or helping to stabilize Afghanistan? These are the kinds of strategic game plans we need to get a sense of, and frankly, we're not getting much of those from either candidate.
To calls, Huntsville, Alabama, for a supporter of Senator McCain. You're up first. Go ahead.
Yes, how could anyone support someone who has so little experience in world affairs and leading our country as a person with only a few years in the Senate, as opposed to a person that has many years' experience with world leaders? And when Senator McCain has so much experience and so much wisdom, and yes, I understand Barack Hussein Obama is a good orator, but I've been in the National Speakers Association since 1976, and you can be a good orator but not have any substance to you. So I really think that the McCain and the governor can lead our country in a better way in this situation that we're in. They both hired and fired and gotten things done. How in the world can anyone want to support someone that has very little experience as opposed to a person with much experience?
Well, the caller raises an issue which has been a significant and long-standing issue in the campaign. I would only add that another dimension beyond either an African American or one of the oldest Americans being elected, and this being a historic level after November 4th, it will be the only third time in American history that the Americans have sent a senator directly from the Senate to the White House. So the question of experience is one that is very malleable and pliable. John McCain has a great deal of experience as a leading legislator, and of course he was a POW in the military, and he's worked on a great number of issues. But in my view, and again, I haven't endorsed either one of these candidates, but in my view, there's another problem in the way in which we look at experience that says that we're at a pivot point in American history. In political science, you would say we're at a moment of discontinuity. And that means that incrementalism and the way in which we used to do things yesterday aren't all that helpful in helping us to figure out what we do tomorrow. So experience can be baggage as well. I think the bigger question is, can you draw together both experience and experts to look at new circumstances and help organize the pieces you have in a very different way so that you can deal with tomorrow's problems? I think since the end of the Cold War, we've had a problem with too much of experience, the wrong kinds of experience in the past. And I think now we need to get back and sort of say, what can we do from the lessons we've learned in American history about power, deterrence, American engagement, the importance of a core economy, and these other factors in terms of leading and inspiring the world. What do you do if the mystique you had as a superpower has been punctured and a lot of the world doubts what you can do? This is a new kind of experience that we need to have, and a lot of people seem to think that Barack Obama may have those skills. I've known John McCain since 1993, and I happen to know that he has those skills too. It's just we're not seeing as much of that dimension of their character that I'd like to see. But I think experience is a legitimate question, and we ought to ponder it, but not just in the old ways.
Middletown, Ohio, for Senator Obama.
Yes.
You're on, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just want to touch on the lady that just spoke. It isn't really all about experience, and they always talk about going back in history. Well, if you go back in history, it shows that twice now that we've had to bail out the Bush administrations. And to get to my point that I originally called for was that this bailout program that's been going on here in the past few days, a week and a half, it's really hit my 401k really hard and my mutual funds and my Roth IRAs. And I haven't heard one president speak about how they're going to repay the citizens in the United States about their retirement packages, but they're still giving out these golden parachutes. I've seen it just yesterday.
Okay, caller, thanks. And Steve Clemons, you started by saying that in case of Senator Obama, there was a tie between national security and economics.
Absolutely.
Where's that tie up at?
Senator Obama gave a very strong talk yesterday saying that if we don't really sort out things at home, we're not going to be able to lead abroad. We won't have the resources to do things abroad, and we can't really be, sort of the beacon on the hill of how capitalism works. I mean, one of the whole ideas about American leadership in the world over these last many decades has been markets and civil liberties and self-determination. All of these come together in the United States, and we're the sort of creme de la creme of that globally. And I think that's come off. I think we've lost a lot of leadership when it comes to the question of our form of capitalism. And to some degree, to address the caller, American citizens to some degree are all stakeholders and shareholders and in both the good decisions the country makes and the bad decisions, which is why voting and civic participation are so important, because these choices really do matter. I heard Tom Friedman of the New York Times speak in a program I was involved with the other night, said, that this bailout program that is often discussed needs to now be directed as a build-up program, that the best foreign policy the United States can have is one that rebuilds the core economy and rebuilds the network of stakeholders in this economy to make it a success. And I largely agree with with Tom Friedman saying that, infrastructure spending and building out, not just spreading money around, but essentially figuring out how can we rebuild the foundations, the infrastructure and the core of the nation. That will then give us a strength and ability to be influential in the rest of the world.
Well, how do both men, what are their plans for the military, if military strength is part of national security?
This is an absolutely important question that's gotten almost no attention. I tend to think, the United States, when you add the supplemental budgets that we've been spending on Iraq and Afghanistan, spends more money on its security and defense than all other nations in the world combined. Mm-hmm. And one would think that if you still don't feel safe as a nation, there's a management challenge there, a management issue that needs to be sorted out. But to critique again McCain and Obama, both have recommended an increased size in the permanent troop allotment of the Pentagon by 92,000 troops. It's somewhere between $30 and $40 billion a year. It's received almost no attention because they both largely agree. We need a larger military to deal with more problems. I myself find that problematic because it doesn't first start with a question of what are America's new objectives in the world, how can we sort out what we have and the leverage to reach those, where do our allies fit in, and then build backwards from that and ask the question of perhaps the United States doesn't quite need to be in every corner of the world to be a promoter and generator of stability. But John McCain and Barack Obama are both on record of being what I friendly called, Pentagon huggers. They want to increase the size of the military, and that will eat up even more resources. I suspect that this is not something they wanted to put on the docket when they were asked during the debates, what would you pare back given the current economic constraints and the economic crisis? But I do bet that beyond the other issues they raised, John McCain said he'd keep everything in place. Barack Obama and Joe Biden said they'd knock off some foreign aid. I actually think the growth of the Pentagon, the growth of the military services will probably also be put into abeyance for a while.
Senator McCain said during the debates a couple of times at least that we have to stop America's program of giving money to countries that hate us. What does that mean to you, and what does it mean as far as a policy issue for him?
Well, I think this question of countries that hate us, I'm going to speak something positive about the Bush administration. James Glassman, who's the current Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, he succeeded Karen Hughes, is a very good guy. And he has come out and said his job is not to go around the world and make the world love America or to judge the world on who loves America and who doesn't. His job is to help try to get forces in place that teach protesters, young people, to choose outlets for their protests that are not violent, not extremist, not violent, not bent on killing others and destroying things. And I actually think that's a very enlightened way to sort of focus the mind on what we do. So I guess I'm concerned by the notion that we would pick and choose how we are going to engage in the world, dividing a line between those who supposedly like us and those we don't. We'd be surprised by areas of the world that don't like us that we absolutely need as strategic partners. Jordan, America is not very popular right now, and Jordan is a fundamentally key strategic ally in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, our popularity is higher, but again, there are complexities in that relationship as well. So I'm not too thrilled with that the sort of moral distinctions between like and dislike. We need to pursue our interests, but we also need to do it in such a way that we show a principled American engagement in the world. And I think we'll see our popularity float up over time.
Steve Clemons is the director of the strategy program at New America Foundation. Auk Bay, Alaska, on our line for others. You are next.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that you feel that way about some of those things, Steve. This is the most militaristic country in the history of the world. We spend 20 times as much money on the military hardware and personnel as Russia and China combined, which you can look up on the CIA website, they'll tell you that. I don't really understand. I'm very disappointed with Obama for not addressing the issue of the military-industrial complex and the way it's bankrupting this country and has been ever since Dwight Eisenhower warned us against it. McCain, I don't expect him to say anything about that type of thing because he's a hack. I'd like to know how it is at his time in Vietnam, where I understand he made so many propaganda films for the North Vietnamese that he was known as the Songbird of Saigon. How exactly that qualifies him to be commander-in-chief? I'll take my answer off the air.
John McCain, when I first came to Washington, I was executive director of the Nixon Center, and John McCain was on my board of directors. And all I can say is that I think he is a thoughtful, great national leader. I disagree with some fundamental aspects of his national security policy, as I do some with Barack Obama, but I don't think that John McCain has ever shown himself to be a dishonorable person in that regard. But on the question of militarism and whatnot, I think what is very interesting is David Petraeus, who's in the news a lot lately, General David Petraeus, was responsible for writing a manual on counterinsurgency. And in that manual, he said that the formula that we need to approach is 80% all sorts of techniques that you would call soft power, 20% is a hard power. And even today, I think that our general response to America's challenges in the world, and even you heard it in Barack Obama and John McCain's comments about Afghanistan recently, both agree that we need to send 2 or 3 more brigades in. It's let me give you a contrasting view of this. Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor to 2 Republican presidents, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Democratic national security advisor and occasionally advising the Barack Obama campaign, both agree that there's no military solution to Afghanistan, that there is no army that we're fighting, that fundamentally there has to be a political arrangement and a very different kind of outreach. This would seem to be the ideal venue to test the David Petraeus thesis that 80% of our efforts need to be in this soft power arrangement, 20% on the other. And I still don't think that we're getting that right, and we're not hearing this from either David Petraeus' best political friend, it seems to be John McCain, or Barack Obama for that matter.
Next call is Denver, Colorado. Good morning.
Good morning. The problem I have with Obama's policies that he's talking about pulling out of Iraq, then bolstering troops in Afghanistan, what would he think, where would he think the Al-Qaeda would go? They would move into Iraq in an unstable government and start a turmoil there when our troops are reduced in Iraq, and then we'll just be moving our way north again. Iran would probably take advantage of the pullout, and then all of our troops would be down in Afghanistan trying to hunt for somebody that we should have had a long time ago. But at the same token, I just don't support Obama's position on that. That's why I think McCain is right by keeping troops in Iraq to stop the Iran influence, but at the same time bolster up troops in Afghanistan. But you got to put them in a squeeze, because the Al-Qaeda is like a cancer, and it was spread all through Iraq and probably into other countries that are around that area. Thank you.
The caller's comment is indicative of how much of a Rubik's Cube the Middle East is, that there are these interlocking pieces. There's this sense of consequence that if you undermine yourself or take out resources in one place, that you'll have a problem there. But just a quick take. First of all, Al-Qaeda insurgents, we know, I recently organized a major conference with various intelligence and defense intelligence experts on the region. And for a lot of complicated reasons, Al-Qaeda insurgents are moving out of Iraq and going to other sites, particularly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others. So whether you want to call that a success of the surge or not, I think that there are a lot of other factors. At least in terms of what Al-Qaeda is deploying, there's less of that kind of problem and instability. About Iran, though, in Iraq, one of the interesting things is when President Ahmadinejad went to Iraq not too long ago, he gave 3 weeks announcement in advance, announced all the venues he would be at, and it was a highly public place. When Dick Cheney or Condi Rice or Bob Gates or others go into Iraq, it continues to be in the dead of night, lots of secrecy, and no one knows they're there until they're there. And so to some degree, Iran is demonstrating repeatedly that it's not worried about stability and security, that it feels pretty good about what's the region. So I don't think our objective necessarily is, if it is to diminish Iran's influence, I don't think that is succeeded. But I do want to say that one of the big things that I'm hoping either a Barack Obama administration or a McCain administration would do is to approach the region without the kind of silos that we typically put on sort of one country at a time. Today we talk about Iraq without looking at its interlocking pieces. Or we talk about the nuclear problem in Iran. Or now we're talking about the border regions between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the revival of the Taliban and throughout the regions, we have peace efforts going on between Israel and Syria right now, which the Turks are helping to organize, and there are efforts underway to try to figure out what to do with Palestine and Israel, and to do this. When I look at the region, and particularly the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, as one of the fundamental grievances that drives a lot of Muslim and Arab anger at the West and the United States, when you look at this, all of these problems affect some other part of the region. And that's to some degree why I think we can't solve or just talk about Iraq anymore. We need to look at a comprehensive answer that begins to resolve some of these issues simultaneously and try and get the benefit of a few wins that might mutually support one another. That's one of the ways the United States may get from being in the red in so much of its foreign policy portfolio back into the black.
Fort Worth, Texas. Good morning. You're on with Steve Clemons.
Yes, thank God for the man from Hawaii. At least he's trying to think things through. That ignorant woman that called earlier, that's the kind of ignorance that got us George Bush and all those old guys that from the Cold War who have caused all these problems. They caused problems in Iran. They caused problems in Iraq. And now they're bitter because it didn't work out, and they have absolutely tried to destroy this country. People need to start thinking. I would much rather have somebody that's thoughtful, that has good, intelligent people around them, and not just vindictive, mean, bitter old men.
Quick response. We've got a diverse group of citizens who see the world differently, and I think that when it comes to how people look at the people around John McCain, all I can say, and I write a blog called The Washington Note. And my blog is pretty progressive, but I'm in more of the realist camp, and most of my good foreign policy friends are what I would call dissident Republicans or dissident realists. It's complicated, and I think that too often we try to attack the moral positions of people as opposed to sort of rational discourse. And I want to mention Zbig Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft again. We helped produce a book which Brzezinski and Scowcroft were involved with, and David Ignatius, the national security columnist for the Washington Post, acted as a moderator for this book called America and the World: Conversations on the Future of American Foreign Policy. They're sort of like the Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon of foreign policy, really. They each want to have the last word. They don't agree on everything. They go round and round each other sort of suspiciously now and then. But they show how you can have a civic discourse about ideas and issues, that you can have a different way of looking at the world and how to think about these things. And I think it's really vital that we go back there. And so when I hear from a lot of my blog readers, or I hear from folks at the New America Foundation where I work who have a different view, I try to not attack their moral position, but rather try to deal with the merit and substance of their commentary. And if you do that, you can often learn a lot. But unfortunately, we're not all put together the same. We're putting together a big national choice, and hopefully November 4th we'll choose a new leadership, and that new leadership will be able to sort of leapfrog into better circumstances for the country.
What types of people are generally advising both senators on foreign policy matters, and do they take that global approach that you talk about as far as looking at countries or regions rather than individual states?
Well, it's varied. To be quite candid, in the McCain camp, Doug Holtz-Eakin, former head of the Congressional Budget Office, is about as unpartisan, nonpartisan a CBO director we can ever have. In fact, if you look at the economic advisors, and they'll not like what I'm about to say, but Doug Holtz-Eakin and Ken Rogoff at Harvard University, former chief economist at the IMF, International Monetary Fund, are both advising McCain. And on the economic side with Barack Obama, you have Jason Furman, who was at Brookings and very close to Larry Summers and Robert Rubin, as well as Austin Goolsbee from the University of Chicago. If you took these four people and put them in the same room, you really couldn't tell anything different about their basic views, how they saw. Their political affiliations are different, but they largely share the worldview. They both have people in the party, each of their own parties, who think differently than they do. In fact, one of the concerns I have, November 5th, you have civil wars breaking out around these candidates. If Barack Obama is elected, you have civil wars breaking out about trade and economic policy, and also about national security issues. The same with John McCain. And on the national security side, you've got a diverse set of players. You've got people like Richard Holbrooke and Anthony Lake, Colin Powell, all advising to some degree the McCain camp, and all of them ferociously disagree with each other about how to proceed and what America's place in the world ought to look like. So what Obama's done is put together a franchise of competing interests. And this is less the case in the National Security Group of McCain, which is dominated more by people we would have recognized from the neoconservative camp. One of the big exceptions on the McCain camp is Richard Armitage has played a high-profile and key role. Richard Armitage was, of course, Colin Powell's deputy at the Secretary of State, reportedly Colin Powell's best friend. I'd love to sort of be at a dinner with Powell and Armitage talking about Colin Powell's recent endorsement of Barack Obama. But it's a diverse set of players. But the neoconservative part of the foreign policy spectrum in the United States is far more dominant in the McCain camp. And I suspect if John McCain is not victorious on November 4th, I think there's going to be some soul searching as to whether that sort of tilt towards a more coercive, a more rough-edged treatment of world affairs that sort of embraced Dick Cheney's perspective, if you will, in foreign affairs, was not a mistake. We'll see what happens on November 4th, but I think there may be some soul searching over that decision.
A supporter of Senator McCain from Silver Spring, Maryland.
Oh, good morning.
You're on, ma'am. Go ahead.
Oh, all right. Oh, gee, where to begin? I wondered if we had had a different scenario had we actually supported our effort in, say Vietnam. I don't remember seeing much publicity about the hundreds of thousands of people that were murdered in Vietnam after our hasty retreat from there. And I also know that the same thing happened in Thailand. I can't remember the numbers. I'm not good at numbers. After all, I'm like 86. But I wonder now, this thing in Iraq, the war was already there. It's been there for decades, and I think many of us realize that. And Bush and Cheney, definitely Cheney, acted on this. I think it's kind of naive to say a president can do all these things that we have equated to Bush, because today our lobbyists and the people who run our government are so influential that you can't say one president has the power to do anything.
Okay. Thank you, caller.
Well, it's very interesting to raise Vietnam, because I think Vietnam and the experiences of Vietnam were very life-shaping for John McCain. And in that worldview, in that narrative, Vietnam is perceived, the perceived loss of Vietnam was something that many Americans, Democrats and Republicans, thought created a domino effect of creating the perception of a weakened America. And of course, Richard Nixon came along in the aftermath of this, Nixon and Kissinger. And Richard Nixon is a fascinating president on so many different levels. Clearly, there were lots of big problems. But Nixon wanted to be president in 1960 and ran against John Kennedy during a time when American power was perceived to be great and climbing to some degree. And Nixon didn't get the chance in 1960 to sort of think as a realist would about how to deal with that world. He had to deal with a world of the perception of declining American power in the aftermath of Vietnam, and to try to preserve American assets and place in the world. I sort of think that we're entering in a phase like this, which is where whether John McCain is elected or Barack Obama is elected, they're going to have to find their inner Nixon, because they're going to have to deal with the perception around the world of declining power and influence, and how you preserve America's leverage and latitude over a lot of big global problems. And so raising Vietnam in that context is very interesting. The problem with Iraq, and why Iraq is such a controversial piece of this, is that many people like myself were completely opposed to the invasion of Iraq because we thought it was too big a gamble of American interests, and that being a superpower is more mystique than real. And if you deploy yourself, it's sort of like Colin Powell says, make sure you win, because if you demonstrate limits on your capacity to achieve your objectives, the first thing to go are your allies, who just don't count on you as much anymore. Then your enemies begin moving their agendas, and the equilibrium in places we had around the world gets thrown off. And that's to some degree where we are today. We're in a world where there is probably no equilibrium, and you have rising powers with pretensions of their own. Iran, clearly, we removed Iran's chief rival in the Middle East, and this tension is building up, and it's a highly dangerous world in that situation. So the notion that you can just assert that America will lead doesn't replace the need to actually get in and roll up your sleeves, do the hard work, build the alliances, and throw yourself at some problems and get some victories.
Bow Bridge, Louisiana, on our line for supporting others.
Good day. What I'm about to say, your so-called expert will probably not agree with, but I would urge people to go ahead and get on the internet and check out some of the things I'm about to say. To start, people have to wonder what we're doing around the world in different countries telling other people how to live. We're in Iraq where cab drivers can trace their family back 1,500 years, and yet we're there. There are 3 city-states. There's the Vatican, there's London, there's Washington, D.C. These city-states do not belong to the countries they're in. They are autonomous. They are run and completely by the Illuminati. I would ask people to look that up. The Illuminati you can trace their bloodlines back all the way to Egypt. They own the banks. Our Federal Reserve Bank is not federal. It is owned by them. They have never been audited. Nobody knows really who owns them. It is why we're going through the crisis worldwide that we're going in now, because they're crashing the economy. This guy's smiling. Smile away.
Well, caller, you've made your point. What's your question?
The question, yes. The question would be, what exactly, indeed, going back, what are we doing around the world if it isn't for the Illuminati? What are we doing trying to police the world? Because the Washington, D.C. is the military branch of the Illuminati.
Okay. Response if you like.
Tough question to respond to. All I can say is that with regard to the economy crashing, and not in response to the caller, but I do think that what's going on in the American economy is vital as a wake-up call to Americans to sort of think through the kind of social contract we had with the world and the sort of messages where we were sending. You know, to some degree, America's had taken on. We used to have debates between, you know, is the model of American capitalism better than the model of sort of Asian or Japanese capitalism versus the model of European capitalism, and those were very sort of triumphalist, debates about how great the United States is and was. And while I think we are great on many things, one of the ways in which I do think we're great is that we can sort of sort these things out, have discussions and discourse, and come back to the question of, was a winner-takes-all capitalism the best kind of model for the United States? And do we need to really think about what the distributional effects of the growth and gains that are generated in an economy and through globalization are generated? And I think, one of the things I've seen is during the Clinton years, it was very clear that was really when globalization became much more of a catchphrase. You saw the kind of globalization we were trying to achieve as higher and higher trust globalization, moving people, ideas, institution, and money more frictionlessly across borders. And to some degree, I think we have a higher fear globalization today. Borders are back. People are not moving as quickly and easily across borders. Institutions and ideas are going to find it, a more viscous world, if you will. And that higher fear kind of globalization and network may not be good, may not be the same kind of thing we need. And I think one of the fundamental measures is how can we redraw the social contract at home so that people feel empowered, feel part of the stakeholding, feel part of the growth and gains. I also think we need a global version of a social contract, if you will. So,
one more call from McLean, Virginia, our line for those who support Senator Obama. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call, and thank you for having your guest. Just a quick question. I've read a lot of military history, and in a particular book by Paul Kennedy, it's sort of famous, called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. And in that book, he defined the term imperial overstretch, in which he said that's a condition where a great power in relative decline begins to spend much more on its so-called security as opposed to investment, thereby exacerbating their declining economy to the detriment of the people. And I would like to ask your guest if he thinks that the United States is basically in this position of imperial overstretch where we've lost so much of our manufacturing and economic power that we're now having to use blunt force military means to try to achieve and maintain our power economically, but that's really a short-term solution. If you look back from the decline of the British Empire after World War II all the way back to the Roman Empire 1900 years ago, you see this pattern of imperial overstretch. And I think that the neoconservatives and the war in the war in Iraq, they want to have a war with Iran, and then the war in Afghanistan. So basically bankrupted the country and thrown us into a period of imperial overstretch. And I appreciate your guest speaker's comments about how we are at a pivotal period in time. I think that the result of what has happened is that as the dollar lost its gold backing because of the debts of Vietnam, I believe that the current debts and the financial crisis will end the dollar's reserve currency role in the following decades.
Fascinating question. I highly recommend to readers to take a look at Paul Kennedy's book written some years ago. And while we may not be an imperial overstretch now, we may be at a fork in the road where many of the characteristics that were raised by Professor Kennedy are there. You know, there's an interesting article. I mentioned Kenneth Rogoff, an economist at Harvard University who's advising John McCain, wrote a great op-ed some years ago in the Washington Post called The Debtor's Empire, and is essentially looking at the United States, the level of debt, and how could you maintain these institutions. Chalmers Johnson, in his book, you know, Blow Back the Costs and Consequences of American Empire, wrote about the 731 military installations America maintains outside the United States and how difficult and complex that is, and how those bases to some degree can both be anchors of stability in the world, but they can also drive instability. But the biggest thing at the Call Kennedy that I think we need to sort of sort out is when you think about what will be how we will sculpt power in the future, at least on the U.S. side. Right now, unless we have a change, if we just let things go the way they are, our power will be driven by two sources: the size of our national debt, we're too big to fail as a country, or the Pentagon, where so many resources. I mean, one of the earlier callers mentioned the militarization of things. One of the really sad but true data points that one of David Petraeus' close aides shared with me is that we have more people in the military today who are musicians than we do have foreign service officers. So, you know, these are the kinds of disparities we have that we need to resolve. And I think that we are at a fork in the road to look at how can we, you know, when I mentioned the ingenuity factor, rearrange the resources and our objectives and the talent that we have in the United States and try to reconfigure those so that we can more healthily engage the world in a different way and not fall into the trap that Paul Kennedy outlined.
Steve Clemons with New America Foundation. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Pedro.
Coming up, we're going to take a look at an amendment in Colorado that deals with when life begins. We're going to take on to that roundtable in just a few minutes. Before that, some more political news. This time, Matthew Murray from Roll Call joining us. Matthew